Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to discuss solvers and GTO trainers. But before I jump in, I just want to say thank you so much for all of the support so far. I've only been YouTubing for about a week and I posted 2 videos, but already they've gotten over 5,000 views. So just wanted to say thank you for that. It really makes it easier for me to stay motivated to make more content when so many people are watching it. And if you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing to my channel so you can see more content from me and hopefully improve as a poker player. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think you should simplify the results that you are seeing from solvers in order to more practically incorporate them into your game. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to answer some of your questions about solvers and also talk about the ethics of commercial GTO trainers, as that's been really top of mind recently in the poker community, especially on poker Twitter. All right, let's jump right into it. I'm going to give you 3 ways that you can simplify solver outputs and just make them easier for you to actually take what you learn and use it in game. So what I'm looking at here is I'm looking at a pre-flop range in GTO Wizard. Specifically, the one that I'm looking at is when it folds around to the small blind open raises to 3 big blinds. And what we're looking at here is the big blind defense versus that small blind open raise. So this is a super common spot. I picked this spot because it's a spot that, despite being extremely common, it really gets butchered by players at all levels. And I'm going to show you how you can simplify this. Now, the first thing that I always do when I take a look at a game theory optimal strategy is I round the strategies. And that's really the first step, because whenever you look at a solution, the computer is going to give you the solution to a really exact accuracy, because a computer can play a certain combo by raising it 13.2% of the time and calling it the rest of the time. And it doesn't really care about how uneven and unnatural that frequency is. Human players can't do that. I always suggest that when you try to incorporate a strategy into your own game, which has mixed frequencies, you keep those frequencies really simple. I use rounding to the nearest 25%. So your frequencies can be 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100. We're not going to be betting or raising a hand 13% of the time or 27% of the time. That's ridiculous. Poker is just way too complicated of a game for you to start doing that, because, even if you can memorize this complete mess of a chart for one spot, well, guess what? There's going to be hundreds of other spots, actually thousands of other spots that you have to try to at least somewhat memorize, and it's just going to fall apart very quickly. So I would suggest rounding to the nearest 25%, if not the nearest 50%, or even in a lot of cases, you can round to pure strategies, and I think that works really well too. So for example, I've just pulled up my solution for this spot, and just if you're wondering why this chart on the right is playing a few more hands than the chart on the left, like for example, Queen 6 and King 5 are getting played a lot more in these suited hands. The suited trash hands like 8-2 suited are getting played on the right, whereas they're getting folded on the left. That's because my sim is a 2000 NL rake structure, and then the sim that I'm looking at in GTO Wizard, they currently only have solutions up to NL 500. So the rake is lower in the sim on the right, which is why there's more hands getting played, but it's basically the same idea. And what I've done here is I've just taken the game theory optimal solution and I've rounded it to pure strategies. So what we kind of are looking at here on the right is if we were to look at the chart on the left, the full solution, and just kind of blur our eyes, that's what the chart on the right looks like. And so we're not 3-betting King 8, King 7, King 6, King 5 at all different mixed frequencies, or Jack 7, 10-7, Jack 8, Queen 8, all of these hands betting at different mixed frequencies. Instead, what we're going to take is just a cluster of these hands, 10-7, Jack 7, Queen 6 off in this case, King 4 off, Ace 6 off, and Ace deuce off are also getting raised. And we're going to pure raise those combos, and then we're going to pure call the other combos. And I've done that for the whole chart so that you're only either folding, calling, or raising. And this makes the chart a lot easier to remember, and it's basically invisible to your opponents, because the nice thing about this strategy is you're hitting exactly the same frequencies as you would be in GTO. You're raising at the right frequency, you're calling at the right frequency, and you're folding at the right frequency to within 1% for each of those. And so for your opponents to actually know what you're doing, this simplification, they would kind of need to have your exact strategy. And then even if they did have your exact strategy and they knew that you were only three betting some hands and not others, it would be pretty hard to remember that in game and actually do something with it and exploit you on the flop, turn, or river for not having certain combos in your range. It's certainly possible, and Pio or another GTO solver could definitely do that, but it's very unlikely that a human opponent would be able to do that. Now, if you want to get even fancier, you can go 50-50 mixed strategies. So maybe pure strategies make you a little bit uncomfortable. Well, here's the same range, but it's just using 50-50 mixed strategies in some spots. So you can see the top of our range, all of our premium hands, they're still pure three betting, but this offsuit junk region and some of the suited junk hands, a lot of these are just raising or calling 50-50 now instead of having pure raises. So this is a little bit more complicated, but now, it's accomplishing the same thing. We're hitting all of our frequencies exactly. And now I'm pretty confident that this is literally not exploitable at all by any human opponent because it's so close to the GTO solution. And if you're wondering what the yellow and purples are, purple just means it's an optional three bet and yellow means it's an optional call. So these are hands that don't have to get into the range for us to hit our frequencies in theory, but we can add them if we want to play a little bit looser. Okay, so I encourage you to try to round like this and keep it as simple as possible, because if you don't, and if you just try to follow the chart on the left, you're going to miss things. And this is just a spot where people really tend to overfold. They often miss these offsuit connected combos. They don't call enough suited trash. And they miss a lot of the three bets because the three bets in this spot are very strange. You don't typically see such a polar three betting range in really any spot in poker in 6 max cash. This is probably one of the most polar spots because you can see we have our premium hands three betting and we have all of these offsuit trash hands. And then we've also got this cluster of suited trash hands and some suited ace-x, and also king-6 suited likes to get in there quite a bit. And people just reliably miss and mess up these strategies. And so what you have is people often folding more like 45, 46%, raising like 13%, and they don't even realize, but it's quite exploitable. If you're not defending enough and you're not three-betting enough, then your opponents can open way wider from the small blind that they're supposed to in theory, and they can steal a lot of money from you that way. All right, so that's rounding. And if you're currently using pre-flop charts that look like the one I have on the screen to study, I suggest going in and creating your own rounded strategies. Personally, I give all of my students rounded pre-flop strategies, usually up until they get to high stakes. Those are pure strategies. And then for my high stakes players who want to get a little bit fancier, I will give them 50-50 mixed strategy pre-flop ranges. The next tip I want to talk about is simplifying to a single size. So let's say that the big blind calls, the small blind's open, we deal a flop, let's choose queen 4 deuce rainbow, doesn't really matter what flop it is. And this is now looking at the small blind's c-bet strategy on this board. And you can see that when you use a trainer like GTO Wizard or really any trainer, it's going to give you by default a minimum of 4 bet sizes to choose from, and often will give you more like 5 or 6 sizes. The reason it's doing this is because it's the most accurate. In theory, a solver wants more sizes to choose from, and the more sizes you give it, the more EV in most cases it can gain. The thing is, though, that in most cases, you can capture like 99.9% of the EV just by using one size. And there are some cases where that's not possible, but you can use 2 sizes in those cases, and they're rare. but you really should never have to use more than two. And in most cases, you could really get away with just using one. In this case, in the small blind flop c-bet versus big blind, that single size is going to be around 30% pot. You can choose quarter pot or 33% pot, it doesn't matter. But if you just use around 30% and no other bet sizes, you will lose almost no EV. And I can prove that to you. Here's an experiment that I ran with PioSolver. So what I did in this experiment is I took this spot, small blind versus big blind, in a single raise pot with a 3x open raise. And I ran a bunch of sims on 50 different boards. So these are the 50 boards on the left-hand side here. And the first sim that I ran was a tree that had 4 sizes for add a position for the small blind. Those 4 sizes were 30, 50, 70, and 100% pot. And then what I did was I compared it to 4 additional sims where the tree only has 1 of each of these sizes for add a position. So the full tree has 4 sizes, and then there are 4 trees with 1 size each, 30 or 50 or 70 or 100. I didn't include the 100% pot data in this chart because there's no way that that's the single best size. And so what I'm doing here in these columns is I'm taking the EV at the root on all these boards. You can do this by using the multi-flop aggregation report feature in PioSolver. But basically, if we look at one board, this is 9 of spades, 3 of spades, deuce. The EV for the add a position player is 31.365 chips. If we take away effectively 3 sizes from the add a position player, and in this column, those are the 3 larger sizes, so only 30% pot is left. The EV of add a position will go down. In this case, it is actually not going down. It actually went up by 0.01%. And the only reason for that is because there's a tiny bit of inaccuracy and noise in these sims because I didn't solve them all the way down to 0. But in the next column here, this is calculating the difference in EVs. So with 30% pot, there was effectively no difference in EV. If we only give add a position 50% pot on this board, now the EV goes down to 31.252 chips. So we've lost 0.19% of the pot if we can only use 50% pot relative to all 4 sizes. And then the next column is for 70% pot. And if I go down and take the averages of all of these losses by simplifying to a single size, what we can see here is the EV loss of simplifying to just 1/3 pot is 0.07% on average across all 50 of these boards. If we were to use only half pot, we would lose about 0.25% of the pot. And if we were to use only 70% pot, we would lose about 1/3% of the pot. So really, none of these options are that bad. But if we look at just 30% pot, we're losing almost nothing. 0.07% of the pot is pretty negligible in the grand scheme of things. If you want to express this in terms of big blinds, what you would do is multiply the size of the pot times this value. So the pot size is 6 big blinds. We're going to multiply that by 0.07%. And we get that we lose 0.004 big blinds per hand. If we want to express that in terms of big blinds per 100, which is usually how we express win rates in poker, we have that we're losing 0.4 big blinds per 100 hands by making this simplification. So it's not nothing, but it's, in the grand scheme of things, again, really negligible. And I would suggest that you just only use this one size, because what is the alternative? The alternative is you're going to add a bunch more sizings on the flop, and not only is it really hard to balance multiple sizes on the flop, but it's basically impossible to then balance the turn and river strategies following the flop. So if you have 3 sizes on the flop instead of 1, now you have 3 strategies on the turn that you have to memorize. And then on the river, you have a strategy for every flop size and every turn size that you chose. So you can see how these sizes really multiply the amount of branches on the game tree, and the complexity of our strategy really explodes on future streets when we start adding multiple sizes to our strategy on the flop or the turn. So whenever possible, you want to try to simplify to a single size, if not two sizes at most. If you want to be very scientific about it, you can try to use the method that I just showed you there with my experiment. But a lot of times you can simply look at a bunch of different boards and choose whichever size is being used most often, and that will often be the size that captures the most EV on its own. In some cases, the solver will use a small size, but it'll also use a large size a significant amount of the time. And a lot of the time in those cases, you can actually just choose the size in the middle and not lose very much EV at all. And then finally, the third tip that I will discuss is to utilize the range bet and the range check whenever possible. So there are a lot of situations in poker where you might be betting a lot and just checking a very little amount, or the opposite. And in those cases, you are usually pretty safe to just always bet or always check. And not only will this simplify your strategy on the current street, but if you have future streets to play, it'll greatly simplify your strategy on those streets down the road. A good rule of thumb is if you're using a small size on the flop, like 30% pot, and the solver wants you to bet with that size more than 3/4 of the time, you can just range bet and you won't lose really very much EV at all. Same with checking. If solver's checking 75% of the time or more, I would just range check. Again, this is for small sizes. You need to be a little bit more strict with your thresholds if you're looking at sims with only large sizes, but it's a good rule of thumb, that 75% rule. And I won't show this experiment, but if you want a really simple small blind c-bet strategy versus the big blind, what you can actually do is just range bet for 30% pot, or you can use quarter pot on all boards except 8 high boards or lower. And then on 8 high boards or lower, you can range check. And if you just follow that simple strategy, you will only be exploitable for about 0.5% of the pot. Now, 0.5% of the pot, could seem like a not negligible amount, and it's not, but now you have to remember that this is different from that sizing study that I just talked about. The sizing study that I just showed you is talking about an unforced error. We are deliberately simplifying to a single size, and we're just giving up EV. Our opponent doesn't have to do anything to capture that EV. When we're range betting or range checking, that's different. We're giving up, maybe 10 times as much EV as the sizing simplification. But in this case, our opponent actually has to adjust to our strategy in order to capture that EV. So if we're range betting, the adjustment that our opponent would have to pull off is they would have to basically fold less and raise more on most boards. And when we're range checking, our checking range is a lot stronger than it should be in theory, and they're going to have to stab less usually. And not only do your opponents need to know how to counter this strategy, they also have to recognize that you're using this simplified strategy in the first place, which is not very easy because they have to basically play this particular spot against you many, many times and get a sample on you and then try to figure out, okay, he's range checking on these boards and he's range betting on these boards. How can I adjust to that? And with this particular strategy on most boards, again, that adjustment is going to involve playing a lot more aggressively versus the 1/3 bet size than the solver would, which just happens to be pretty convenient because if you study, you can look this up in your database, how people respond typically to small c-bets when they're in position. Usually what they do is they overfold and they underraise because in theory, you can barely fold. You can only fold like 25% of the time, roughly, versus a 1/3 c-bet in position in this spot. And you have to raise quite a bit, maybe up to 15% of the time. And that's very counterintuitive. People typically don't do it. So in order to adjust against you, they're going to not just adjust, but first correct their mistake, which is playing too passively, and actually go over the threshold beyond GTO and play more aggressively than GTO. And if they're just by default playing too passively, It's very unlikely that's going to happen. And in any case, we can be sure that whatever adjustment that they make, it's going to be nowhere near as accurate as the solver's adjustment to us would be, because the solver can exploit us in ways that we can't even comprehend. And so it's impossible that any human opponent would capture the full 0.5% of the pot from us, or whatever the EV loss of our strategy is, in theory, if we were to get max exploited. All right, I asked you guys some questions about solvers and trainers on Twitter. I'm going to respond to those now. And let's start with the big one. This is the one that I'm assuming people are most interested in, based on the fact that there was a big discussion on poker Twitter in the last week about how a lot of GTO trainers, the way that they're set up with no delay, can potentially be used as real-time assistants. So if somebody wanted to, they could open GTO Wizard or some other trainer while they're playing poker and kind of click the actions that are happening in the hand that they're playing and just follow the instructions from GTO Wizard. And effectively, they're playing as a GTO bot. So somebody said, why do you endorse using GTO Wizard when it has no delay and it encourages RTA? So first of all, just for transparency, I do have an affiliate code for GTO Wizard. To date, I've made about $100 off of that affiliate code. So it's not enough to really sway my opinion or bias me in any significant way. I have talked about potentially sponsoring GTO Wizard more on my social media and potentially on this YouTube channel at some point. You guys may see that. But really, I would just be using Wizard whether or not they were sponsoring me, because it's just my preferred trainer at the moment. And my short answer is that I don't think GTO Wizard or any other trainer really encourages RTA in any sort of realistic way that we would need to be worried about as poker players. Now, you're going to hear people have the complete opposite opinion from me. So I just want to explain in very simple terms why I think that, and just back up my argument with some logic. So the first thing I would say is to just encourage people to actually think about how this would work if somebody wanted to use GTO Wizard to cheat at online poker. They would have to click each action that happens as they're playing their games. And that takes time. And on a lot of poker sites, you don't have very much time to act. Now, there are some poker sites like Bovada that give you just way too much time to act, and I think they should fix that for sure. I think Bovada gives you like 60 seconds to act even pre-flop, which is absurd. They should definitely fix that. But on most poker sites, you don't get nearly that much time. And so if you're clicking the actions into GTO Wizard as you're playing, you're not going to be able to play more than like one table at a time, maybe two if you're really good at it. And so if you're playing one or maybe two tables simultaneously, you're not going to make very much money playing poker. Even if you're playing 500 NL, you're simply not going to be able to make a living wage in most parts of the world. You're going to be pushing a pretty small edge, and you're just not going to get any volume in. So you're not going to be making money. You're not going to be taking very much money out of the ecosystem. And I don't think it's something that we really need to worry about. I would be more concerned about people cheating in a more sophisticated way by using screen grabbing software and maybe their own library of sims. I would not be very concerned about a 200 NL or a 500 NL player using GTO Wizard and clicking in actions to cheat. It's possible that at 1K or maybe 2K NL plus, a player could use GTO Wizard or a similar trainer and play one or two tables and effectively be a bot. And they could actually make a living wage playing poker that way. They could make decent money doing that. What I have seen is that this generally, it just isn't happening. Now, I'm not going to say there's no cheating happening. There certainly is cheating happening at high stakes. It's just not enough to make the games unbeatable by any stretch. And if you study databases the way that I do, I study, all high stakes databases on all of the most popular current poker sites. those sites are playing nowhere near GTO. In the aggregate, nowhere near GTO. And so clearly these players are not using solvers, at least not most of the time, to help them play, because you just look at their stats and their stats are all wrong. If their stats were perfect, on average, if you had players playing extremely close to GTO, then I would say there was a little bit more cause for concern about this. But that's simply not the case right now. And I think there's actually kind of an interesting reason for this. And it reminds me of a video that I wish I could remember what it was, but it was either an interview or a Run It Once video that Sauce did, Ben Solsky. And he was talking about how he's been kind of predicting the demise of poker ever since solvers came out, or even a bit before that, when people had private solvers before PioSolver came out. And he was talking about how that just really hasn't happened. And it's not because people can't get RTA. There are solutions out there where people have programs that you can buy on the black market where you get some screen grabbing software and it automatically tells you the game theory optimal solution so that you don't have to click things in and do things manually. And it's scary as a professional poker player that those things exist. But the reality is that at high stakes, most players are apparently choosing not to do that, which is pretty cool. And Sauce said that he was pleasantly surprised to see that. And I think the reason for that is that poker is pretty hard, and you have to think about what it takes to actually get to high stakes. You have to love the game. You have to deal with big swings, and it's incredibly difficult on your mental health sometimes to be a professional poker player. You have to put a lot of work in. And cheating in poker is sort of like the antithesis of that. To cheat is really disrespectful to the game, I think, to many, many high stakes poker players. So you would have to have somebody who either just had a ton of money to start, like, you know, if they're playing 5K and L, you need like $250,000 to be comfortably rolled for those games, comfortably. So you need somebody, if you're going to have a cheater, you need somebody who has money and has the willingness to cheat and doesn't really care very much about poker. Or you need somebody who just happens to be very good at poker and has played for a very long time, but just for whatever reason has no morals or concern about degrading the game by cheating. They just want to win. And there are some people out there. There have been people actually in recent memory who have been exposed. They're extremely good poker players, and yet they just choose to cheat anyway because that's who they are. But I think those people are very, very rare. And finally, my last point that I'll just say about this is that I think people should have a little bit more trust in the poker sites to police this, because there is no one who has more of an incentive to stop cheating than the poker site does. If people lose trust in a poker site, if people lose trust in the integrity of the games, they stop playing there and the poker sites stop making money. There are definitely ways that cheating can be detected, and people actually do get banned on poker sites. I've seen it happen. And so when people are getting banned occasionally, we can assume that poker sites are actually doing things to police this, and they're not necessarily going to be transparent about what they're doing. Because if they are transparent about it and they just say, hey, everybody, here's exactly what we're doing to catch the cheaters, well, obviously the cheaters are going to be pretty interested in that information, and it might help them to avoid detection. So I don't think that the poker sites necessarily should just come out and say everything that they're doing to expose cheaters. But I can tell you, as somebody who works a lot with databases, it is sometimes fairly easy to catch people who are doing this, especially if you see somebody who was kind of a trash poker player for a long time, and then suddenly they just start winning out of nowhere. that's kind of a red flag that maybe we should just like check this person out and see, how close to GTO they're playing. Chess sites do this. It's now possible in poker to do what chess sites have been doing for a long time, which is to test a player's accuracy relative to GTO. In fact, GTO Wizard has a feature that the public can use just like this. You upload your hand histories, and it actually auto detects anytime that you make a mistake, which would never happen if you were playing the game theory optimal strategy, and it can tell you what your accuracy is. So if these tools are available to the public, you can be sure that poker sites have probably had them for a long time and probably have even more sophisticated versions, teams of people on their security looking into this. So I know that right now, especially with the poker market the way it is, sometimes we do have to rely on kind of sketchy sites, and that's just the way poker is right now. But I would say that, even like the sites that we consider to be kind of sketchy still understand that they have a really strong incentive to keep the games fair, and they are looking into this and policing it. So that's my take on trainers and real-time assistants. I do think that RTA is something that we should be concerned about, but I don't think that trainers are going to lead to a large amount of cheaters in online poker. It just doesn't logically make sense to me. All right, next somebody asked, thoughts on DTO as a trainer? I think it's way more intuitive than the others, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts. My thoughts are, although I prefer to use GTO Wizard, I think you should try them all, try the free versions, and just use whatever you think is the most intuitive and helpful for you. Because in reality, some trainers have features that are better than others, and some trainers have features that are worse. But in reality, they're all just studying the same game theory optimal solutions, more or less, and they're all pretty similar. So I think you should just go with whatever one you like the best. Somebody said, how do you split different areas of solver study up? Do you compartmentalize flops, turns, and rivers, or prefer studying hands and spots as a whole? This is a great question. The way that I try to do it is I study from the beginning of the hand to the end of the hand first, because I want to be studying spots that are happening most often. So I'll start with pre-flop, and then I'll move on to the flop, and I'll usually start with flop c-bets, since those are the highest impact spots. By high impact, I mean most commonly occurring, most money going into those spots on average. So I will literally go spot by spot, like create a big project plan and say, okay, I'm going to study flop c-bets in single raise pots, then flop c-bets in 3-bet pots. Then when I'm done with that, I will move to the turn and say, I'll study double barrels in single raise pots, and then double barrels in 3-bet pots, and delay c-bets in single raise pots, and just go down the list until I feel like I have a strong strategy in each of those, working my way down to the river, because I feel like the river it's a little bit more of an intuitive street to play in a lot of situations. It's still certainly very hard, but I think that, at least until you get the flop and turn kind of down, you can wing it on the river more or less without doing extensive solver study, and you can do okay. I would save the river towards the end because those spots are less commonly occurring. And then once you get to the point where you're studying rivers, and then I think you can kind of study hands as a whole, like you said, using a trainer maybe to simulate entire hands. I think that's a great idea. And if you want to get super fancy, then what you can do is try to quantify what I call the impact factor of each spot. So what you would do is go into your database and look at how often a spot occurs and how much money goes into the pot when it does occur, and multiply those two together, and then you'll get a number which you can compare to other spots. And you want to study the spots with the highest number, the highest impact factor first. And I think if you do that experiment, I won't give away the results, but you might find that it's a bit counterintuitive which spots have
a lot of money going into them and which spots are just really not that important in the grand scheme of things.
Somebody asked, will solvers or AI kill poker in the future? I don't think so, but I do think that it's pretty likely that people are going to, in 10 years, maybe 20 years, at the top levels, at least up until the river, they will be playing so close to GTO that it's pretty difficult that anybody would ever be able to exploit them realistically for any sort of like significant win rate. That being said, I think once you get to the river, things are so complicated that there is still a potential for exploits. It's just going to be poker among the top professionals is going to be played at a much higher level, sort of approaching like what chess is played at. Probably still not even close to that, just because chess is so much more competitive than poker. But it's going to go in that direction. I don't think it'll kill poker because I think poker is always going to be played by recreationals for fun because people just love to gamble, and that's kind of what keeps the whole ecosystem thriving. What I worry more about killing poker is that the average regular gets so good at exploiting recreationals that the recreationals almost never have a winning session, and it just is not a fun game for them to play, so they'd rather go gamble their money on slots or blackjack or something where they actually have a chance to win. I think that could potentially kill poker because that would cut out the recreational players who are kind of funneling money into this ecosystem and making the whole thing run. If it wasn't for them, and if they weren't having a positive experience playing, then poker kind of turns into chess where people just, are grinding it out, and it's professionals competing against other professionals, and only a handful of them are actually making any money doing it. In that case, I think we just have to change the rules of the game to make them more favorable to recreational players. And there's a lot of different ways you can do that. I mean, ACR has bomb pots, which are cool because it kind of just throws, people into a whole unknown environment where they haven't really studied, and then they just have to wing it, and it adds a lot of variance to the game. So stuff like that I think is cool and will prolong the longevity of poker. Okay, somebody asked, for kinesthetic learners, do you think it's possible to build intuition purely drilling trainers? Do you see an evolution of node lock trainers where you can be scored based on your response compared to what's optimal for MDA? That means like what the population is doing. The second part of the question, I'm not really sure. Probably not, I would say. So I'll respond to the first question. So basically what this person is asking is like, can you just drill trainers and look at solutions? I think this is what they're asking, and actually retain information and learn things. I would say the answer is no, except for a very small percentage of the population. You do have some players who are just extremely talented. They have sort of an intuitive understanding of what the solver is doing, and they can just look at a sim and they can kind of just get it. Like they understand why it's doing that, and they're able to remember the solutions that they're looking at. They have just very, very strong memories. And some of the best players in the world are just like this. So for a very small subset of people, I think that you can learn just by drilling solvers. But for people like me, I need to use more advanced techniques to actually take away information from the solvers. So I'm not looking at individual sims. I'm looking at many sims simultaneously. I have custom software that allows me to do this, to look at many boards in the aggregate and look at what hand categories are doing. And then I can kind of take that information and build protocols out of it. That's the way that I study. I've never been able to just kind of inspect solver outputs and actually come away with very much of like anything useful from that, especially on earlier streets like flop and turn strategies. It's just really hard. So I think for most people, if you want to actually learn theory, you need somebody doing that hard work of taking all the data from the solver and simplifying it into something that you can reliably use in game and understand. And just as a final thought on your question, you mentioned kinesthetic learners. This has to do with learning types. So some people are audio visual learners. Some people are kinesthetic learners, which means you learn, I think, by doing things, in this case, by playing poker. Learning types have no basis in science. They were just made up by some educator, I think, from New Zealand or maybe Australia. And they just are one of these pseudoscience things that just randomly caught on, and somehow everybody thought that it was a real thing. So there's a really good video on the YouTube channel Veritasium about this. I would encourage you to go watch it. If you follow me and you like my stuff, you're probably interested in debunking pseudoscience, so I'm assuming that you would find that entertaining. Another person said, does a solver have a positive red line? So this is the non-showdown winnings in your graph. If that's higher than 0, then it's a positive red line. Someone said a solver can't beat, some people said a solver can't beat the rake on Zoom poker. So I think that if you were to put a solver into real games, in most cases, it would probably have a positive red line, if not like neutral or close to that. Because typically in real games, on average, people play too risk averse and they fold too much. So if you played a solver against another solver, then probably the red line wouldn't be positive. But if you put a solver against a bunch of humans who are playing too passively, then the solver is going to kind of steamroll the human players and steal a lot of pots away from them. And in that case, I think it's possible, maybe even likely, that the solver would have a positive red line. But I don't actually know, and I don't know of anybody who's actually done that experiment. So that's a tough one to say. To your second point about the solver not being able to beat the rake on Zoom poker, I assume you're talking about lower stakes. I mean, I've heard a lot of people make the claim that a solver can't beat low stakes. To me, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It doesn't really even pass the smell test to me, because I know that there are a lot of regs playing low stakes right now, and they're beating low stakes. And those players are certainly not exploitative geniuses. In fact, I think they have a lot of bad ideas about how you're supposed to exploit their population. They're just low stakes players. Like, they're not good at poker, frankly. So if you were to put a solver in the game, certainly it wouldn't be exploiting the opponents intentionally, but I think the opponents are making enough mistakes just naturally, and the solver's playing perfectly in theory, that it would be able to beat those games. And I think it would probably have a pretty decent win rate in those games. It's possible I could be wrong about this, but I just don't see how a solver doesn't beat low stakes. I don't get it. I don't get how people can make that claim. And again, this hasn't been proven by anybody, as far as I can tell. I think the only proof that we have really is in support of my case, which is that there have been bots discovered at low stakes. I would imagine they're like sort of simple solvers, and presumably those have been making money, otherwise they wouldn't exist. And so I think, that's maybe a little bit of evidence that solvers could actually beat low stakes, but I don't actually know. And finally, somebody asked a really good question, which is, what is the best way to understand why a solver does what it does? I feel like it can be easy to come up with false explanations. Totally, I 100% agree with this. One of my least favorite things is to be in a study group where people are looking at a sim and they're taking some like really obscure blocker effect and they're trying to explain why the solver is doing that. I mean, it can be useful to try to explain what a solver is doing, but you have to have some humility about just like knowing that you're not always going to understand why a solver is doing what it's doing. And you're certainly not going to be able to incorporate that kind of strategy into your own game if it's something that you don't really fully understand. So when you are studying with solvers, I would encourage you to just keep coming back to first principles. So for example, if you're bluffing, what you want to happen when you're bluffing is that you're blocking your opponent's value and you're not blocking his folds. If your bluff has those two qualities and it's going to fold a lot of stronger hands, then that's a good candidate for a bluff. On the other hand, if you're blocking a lot of your opponent's folds and you're not blocking his value, that's going to be a bad candidate for a bluff. And trainers like GTO Wizard will actually show you for each combo how much value that combo removes when it's betting and how much trash that combo removes when it's betting. So those are really useful tools. I would encourage you to just focus on first principles like that, very simple stuff, and just try to use those principles when you're analyzing what a solver is doing. Not to get too much more complicated than that, because again, anything more complicated than that is going to be pretty hard to incorporate into your own game if it's even true. You might just be guessing if you're trying to come up with more complicated reasoning beyond that. So just keep it really simple and you'll go very far. You don't need to come up with extremely complicated explanations for why a solver is doing what it's doing to get value out of studying with solvers. All right, guys, that's it for this episode. Thank you again for watching. I hope you learned something from this video, and good luck at the tables.